Hello, it's Penny Meganson from the Meganson Method, and welcome to Penny for Your Thoughts, where we discuss how our thoughts and mindset affect our health, happiness, and performance. And I'm joined here today in this episode, Beating Binge Eating, with Stephenie Farrell. And Stephenie is a certified intuitive eating counselor. And we're going to be talking about the science behind binge eating, as well as EFT tapping, which is a really useful tool. We're going to talk about the stress response, and we're going to finish off with some great ways to overcome binge eating. So let's get started. Hello, Stephenie. Welcome.
Hi, Penny. So nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Great, great. So let's just get right into it by breaking down what binge eating is exactly, what leads to it, what's the science behind it?
Well, in terms of binge eating, right here, I'm not talking about diagnosed binge eating, so that's important to note. But binge eating is something that people are very familiar with, I think. And what really happens is it's a result of physical and mental or emotional restriction. So it's that out of control feeling, around food, that out of control eating. And what sets it up really in the first place is feeling like we need to lose weight, right? That diet mentality, feeling uncomfortable in our bodies, feeling like we need to lose weight. And then, we go on a diet, maybe we lose weight, then we gain it back and we feel guilt, we feel shame. And then the cycle continues. So that cyclical and chronic dieting can actually really perpetuate the binge eating. And in terms of why people binge eat, there are probably about 4 reasons why. And one of those reasons, of course, is biological. So it's biological hunger. It's that animal hunger, right? If you've been restricting yourself from eating for quite a while, I mean, you're on a diet or you're restricting food, and your body doesn't know that like there's a Starbucks on the next corner or your fridge is fully stocked. So the body really goes into that starvation mode, that famine mode, and feels like it's starving. You're not getting enough energy. So when that happens, of course, naturally, when you come in contact with some kind of food, you want to eat. And that's that out of control feeling because your body needs to get that energy, pardon me, from your food. And then there are a couple of other reasons. So reason number 2, I would say, is stress. That stress from rigid food rules that we have, moralizing food, good and bad. So people will put certain foods off limit. And then when we do break down and eat that food, it's kind of this all or none thinking.
Absolutely.
Like, what the heck? I'm just going to eat it all, right? Because I might not get it again. So that's another thing too. When we vow to start our diet, it's like this last supper eating. It's like the last time we're going to have this food. We better eat it now and get it all in because we're not going to have it later. And then there's self-care. So if we're not looking after ourselves appropriately, if we're not getting enough sleep, if we're too stressed, if we don't take time for play, then all of those things are going to contribute to binge eating. A lot of people who don't get enough sleep will and I hate to say the word overeat, but they'll eat more in response to that because they feel like it's giving them more energy. Where in fact, it's really not. It's kind of draining the energy, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's interesting. What do you think about self-sabotage as well? Because I find with a lot of clients, as they're starting to get, and maybe some of our listeners can resonate with this, but as you're losing weight and you're getting closer to your goal, it's like the body wants this sense of homeostasis, this need to stay the same. So it
Mhm.
starts to have more cravings and wanting the things that you're limiting yourself even more than you did even before you started this whole pattern of, healthy exercise and eating habits. And it's like a way of just trying to keep us from changing our bodies. And it seems like that starts that cycle of being out of control. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I think that's true. I mean, we all have this biological set point. It's a weight where our weight will pretty much stay the same. Um, in terms of aging factors, that changes as you get a little older. Um,
Mhm.
as we go through adolescence, that changes a bit too, because of hormonal reasons. But we have this set point weight. I mean, mine is 10 pounds or 20 pounds up or down, right?
Mhm.
And our body wants to stay there. That's where our body functions the best. So when we start messing around with that and playing around with that and restricting our food and dieting and then cycling, weight cycling, it's really very, very bad for the health. It creates a lot of stress. It creates a lot of chronic illness and such as well. So just playing around with that, playing around with our metabolism, every time we go on a diet and restrict food, it's at least 95% of people who go on a diet and lose weight within a number of years gain it all back, plus then some. And mostly that weight gain is it's not muscle; they're losing muscle, right?
Mhm.
We start playing around with um, our set point, start playing around with metabolism. It affects all kinds of things as well in the body, which is when you can get into like hypothalamic amenorrhea as well for young women and for women.
Yeah.
So it can really mess with hormones and mess with a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So one thing I noticed with working with clients is there's such a strong emotional connection with food. And so I thought, why don't we talk about that as well? What have you seen with clients, and what do you feel about this emotional connection?
Oh boy, I feel there's a huge emotional connection. Eh, just for myself, I've seen it definitely. I've seen it with clients for myself. I mean, I've suffered with disordered eating of various sorts since I was knee high to a grasshopper. So since I was very young,
Mhm.
and for me, it was this sense of safety. And for most people, it is a kind of feeling of not being safe in the world, not being safe maybe in the home. There's issues at home or whatever the stress might be. It could
Mhm.
be a loss. I've seen it, grief, feeling abandoned. Those kinds of feelings a lot of the time are really underneath. For me, it was not feeling safe. There was a lot of stuff going on in my home. And I turned to food because it made me feel better. And
Mhm.
I find a lot of people find that comfort in food.
Yeah.
There's the other range of things where people feel more comfort controlling their body and restricting. So for me, that became kind of a pattern, finding comfort in food, binge eating, bulimia, and restricted eating. So yeah, it's a
Yeah. Yeah.
huge.
Yeah, so I found it was really trying to figure out what is that gap that the food is filling,
Yeah.
and starting from there, and trying to figure out whether it's boredom or whether it's some sort of emotional comfort that you're looking for, or whether it's stress that leads to the binge eating and that sort of thing. And so going to stress, let's talk about the stress response and how that plays into all of this.
Yeah. So, I mean, um, in terms of the stress response, when you experience something that feels threatening or dangerous, your body has this innate reaction, right? Your
Mhm.
nervous system goes into the fight, flight, and freeze response, basically the stress response. And, you know, most of the times in today's society, most of the time, if you're in a traffic jam, if you're, if you're whatever it is that you're doing, you're not really experiencing a real threat to your life or safety, but your body believes that it is. Your nervous system believes that it is. So what happens as the fire alarm goes off, the amygdala in the back of the brain, this little almond-shaped primal part of the brain, starts setting off this fire alarm, and you get this cascade of reactions throughout the body, throughout the nervous system, saying, you better run away or stand and fight, or you're just gonna sort of roll over and play possum, right? So
Mhm.
freeze. Um, excuse me. And when that gets to a certain state, you can be in chronic stress. So, I mean, particularly as we were talking about emotions and in childhood, if you have a traumatic experience in childhood, if you have a traumatic experience later in life, or if you have what I say are like microaggressions, weight based microaggressions, those
Mhm.
are very traumatic. They create trauma, they create that stress response in your system. So your nervous system is kicked into high gear and it's stuck there. So that also takes us out of our rational brain, takes us offline. And then, in terms of the eating, that's become our pattern. That's become our coping mechanism over many years. So we're in that stress response chronically. Well, we're going to turn to food, right? To make us feel safe, to make us feel better. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, so then how do you reverse that?
Well, for me, I use a lot of emotional freedom technique. I'm
Yeah.
a certified practitioner of emotional freedom technique, and EFT is fantastic. It's AKA tapping or EFT tapping, and it's a
Just
science.
for the audience, I think we're both EFT practitioners, and so we should probably break it down. So you can go ahead. The science behind EFT tapping and what makes it work, and then we can talk about how it works in this environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I use so much of it with my clients one-on-one for many reasons. As you mentioned, I am a intuitive eating counselor as well, but I find that the EFT really helps people make those shifts uh, toward those 10 principles, and it makes it a lot easier for my clients. Um, but in terms of EFT tapping, it's a somatic cognitive energy technique. So soma, of course, body, cognitive thoughts,
Mhm.
cognition. It regulates the stress response, so it down regulates that stress response, and it helps us to perceive things differently. So it rewires the brain as well, those neural pathways. And in terms of the emotional eating, that's a neural pathway we've created. It's a pattern we created time after time of turning to food. So it works beautifully in terms of emotional and binge eating. But it actually creates those new neural connections, teaches your nervous system to behave differently in response to what feels threatening. So, external circumstances. So, when you feel a trigger, you respond very differently than
Yeah.
once you may have responded in a different manner. It really changes our thoughts, our perceptions.
Just to clarify, so EFT tapping, for those of you that are watching or listening and you're not familiar, you're tapping on different areas that are points on Chinese meridians. And so it's based on these Chinese meridians and getting this continuous flow. And the thought behind it or the science behind it is that when you're having these negative emotions all throughout life, from the time you're born onwards, that these negative emotions can get sort of stuck in our bodies. And what we're trying to do is clear them. And so
Mm,
when we get triggered from a stressful event or something makes us angry, that's usually because it's connected to something from the past that's happened before. And when these continue to happen, these events happen throughout our life, they build up on each other. And so by clearing them from the start, it's kind of like peeling back the layers of an onion, getting to the core issue. And once we clear that, then you don't have that same sort of negative emotion to that same event. So that's how it And that's sort of the science behind why it changes how we deal with a situation. So a boss shouting at you isn't going to take you back to all those years that your father would shout at you and make you feel small and make you feel insignificant or not clever and that sort of thing. It'll just be your boss shouting, and it doesn't mean anything to you, and you don't get that same level of stress or needing to go home that day and just eat a pint of ice cream because you just felt so bad in that situation. And so that's how EFT, and it's so effective that you don't even know what's happening. It feels like nothing is happening. I find most of my clients kind of giggle about it and say, I feel like this is silly, nothing's happening, but then change happens and they just feel different. They behave differently. It's really, really impactful, I find.
Mhm.
Um,
In terms of lowering the stress response and changing the thoughts, it also, I mean, it regulates the nervous system. So when we tap on these meridian points, it's actually taking us out of either that fight flight
mhm.
hyperactive or the hypoactive, that
Yeah.
freeze response, and it just brings us back to that homeostasis in our nervous system. So when we can stay there in that homeostatic state, um, we are more connected to ourselves, to others. We are more connected, and we're not responding so negatively to these
Yeah.
issues. So
Yeah.
absolutely. Hmm.
You just end up being able to think more logically, more rationally. And so all these bad habits like binge eating, cravings, all of these things just sort of die down. They just don't seem to exist, or they don't overtake your daily life. That's what I find with a lot of my clients.
Well,
Yeah.
craving in terms of cravings are absolutely normal if you're restricting your food intake. So that's why I really help people stop chronic dieting, because it just perpetuates the problem. Biologically, we can't overrun that, but we can learn to break patterns and manage
Mhm.
patterns and deal with all the underlying emotions that we have with emotional freedom techniques.
Yeah. Yeah. So going to that, what are some tips that you have for the listeners on how they can overcome binge eating if that's something that they're struggling with at the moment?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that we want to do is in terms of number one, I would say shifting away from that diet mentality,
Mhm.
shifting away from dieting, because, like I said, chronic dieting, chronic food deprivation is going to basically put you in that mode of restriction, and restricting food intake leads to binging. So chronic dieting leads to binge eating. And uh, then number two, eating at least every 5 hours. So trying to eat normally throughout the day. A lot of people restrict throughout the day, and then they find themselves binging or feeling out of control around food at night. But really, if you're feeding yourself adequately during the day, every 5 hours, that that is going to lessen, right? And
Mhm.
then number three, really exploring your relationship with food. So not trying not to moralize foods as good and bad. And by the way, all of these things are very difficult to do. They are difficult to do. Intuitive eating is fantastic, but EFT is an amazing tool to add along with that to help people get out of that dieting mentality. And in terms of the moralizing foods, their beliefs about foods, good and bad, and to explore that relationship they have with foods. Um, but also, one thing I would say is really finding, in an emotional sense, finding out what their real needs are um, in terms of emotions. A lot of the times that breaks down to like setting boundaries. For a lot of my clients, boundaries is a real issue, and self-silencing. And I think for a lot of women, at least my age, self-silencing is something we learned as children. So it's hard to break. But again, EFT can help that.
Mhm.
Practicing can help that. So three things to ask yourself if you find yourself eating for emotional reasons could be, you know, what am I feeling? If you can really zero down on what you're feeling, and then say, what am I feeling? Acknowledge it, and then say, well, what do I really need? It's maybe not food that I need. It's something else. I have a deep need for something. If it's connection, if it's a loneliness you feel, you might need connection, or whatever it is for the person. And then really thinking like, how can I meet that need? What can I do right now to help me meet that need? That's not uh, placing that importance on food. So maybe it's connecting with a friend over Zoom. And I know it's
Exactly.
very stressful these days.
Mhm.
So people have a lot of need for connection and loneliness. So those
Yeah.
are three things that I would definitely ask. If you're reaching for food for emotional reasons. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and just in the way that you were describing that, I think what I find a lot of people do is they're not comfortable sitting with those feelings, and it's so important to be able to do that, even if it feels bad. Just sit with it and try and sort of understand it and understand why am I feeling like this,
Hmm.
to really get to that core issue. Otherwise, if you're constantly going around it, trying to fill your time with other things, that's what that binge eating is. It's like you're just filling that gap or filling that time so you don't actually have to deal with the stuff you need to deal with. And so give
Exactly.
yourself just that quiet time to just listen to what's going on in your head or in your body, and do that instead of the eating, because the eating is just keeping you busy so that you're not focusing on the real stuff. And
Wow.
so, yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
This is where the EFT comes in, and it's so beautifully it fits with this work that I do. Just
Yeah.
getting under there and scooping out some of those emotions and really finding out what it is and dealing with it and being more comfortable over time dealing with
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Now, do you have a client story or anything, a personal story to share with the listeners of how either EFT tapping helped or just someone's journey through getting over this binge eating pattern?
Yeah. Well, I do have lots of clients that have been through generations of binge eating, chronic dieting, having huge successes, but I always like to bring it back to myself because I
Mhm.
have so much experience over the years, over 20 years of disordered eating behaviors. And, I think I always searched for something to help me, but it wasn't really until I found emotional freedom technique that it really got to the root of my issues. So, dealing with the chronic trauma that I dealt with growing up,
Mhm.
vicarious trauma, um, both emotional and mental emotional and also physical trauma.
Mhm.
It really helped to deal with a lot of that, helped me discover a lot of my issues related to body image, my beliefs about myself and the world, beliefs about my body, generational beliefs that were kind of placed on me. My
Mhm.
parents did the best they could, but my mother had issues with body image and weight and all those kinds of things. So, really doing that deep work with emotional freedom technique, and in conjunction with, I also practice trauma sensitive or trauma specific yoga. So
Mhm.
that the somatic aspect of those things, plus intuitive eating and really getting away from the diet mentality and making peace with all foods, allowing myself all foods. It's just, I'm completely a different person than I was
Yeah.
before. And I see that in my clients too. I had one young woman who said, you're the first person that I talked to about my disordered eating that really made an impact on me, and really helped me deal with um, my internal stuff. So just hearing that, just knowing that I'm helping women in that way, just warms my heart.
Well, I just wanted to mention, because I think often we were talking more and more about trauma,
Oh
and
yeah.
I think a lot of people think trauma has to be something really drastic, a rape or something, physical abuse as a child and these sorts of things. And a lot of the trauma that I see is what I like to call micro trauma. There are little things that you think, oh, well, everybody sort of has that sort of thing. Either a parent that really never showed affection, or a parent where nothing was ever good enough. These little things that over time just, sort of become a huge part of who you are or who you feel you're not, because it was just cyclical. It was just something that you were dealing with all the time, and you might not even be aware of it because it feels so normal. And these little micro traumas, I find, are the things that we can't see because they're just so small and insignificant that we don't really think about them. And that's the stuff that I find when I'm doing EFT tapping with clients comes up all the time. This
Oh,
feeling of not being good enough, nothing is ever good enough. And it's just because that parent was maybe just a bit too busy. And maybe it wasn't that their parent wasn't there for them, but they were just a bit too busy. And that, as a child, made them feel that they weren't good enough, or they weren't interesting enough, or something like that. Something as small as that can lead to such a big thing like burnout. I see a lot of burnout in clients, and that can stem from something so small as that. And I see the same with binge behaviors, where it's really just trying to fill some hole that's there because of something that was so small from a childhood event, that didn't seem very significant, and the person isn't even aware of it. So trauma doesn't always have to be big traumas.
mm-hmm.
It can be lots of small things that compound and become something that feels very negative for the person. And these are things that I feel really lead to all of these bad behaviors that just aren't working for us. And
Trauma is really a perception. Actually,
mhm,
it's that person's perception of what is traumatic. So,
exactly, yeah,
say too, the similar, it's the same thing happens to you and I. And maybe I would interpret that, and my system would interpret that as being a trauma, and you might be fine. And as you mentioned, those little micro traumas along the way, and living in a weight, uh, a diet culture where
mhm,
we're driven to, you know, we see it every day. We're just swimming in this diet culture.
yeah.
It's just
This need
infiltrating
for
all
perfection
around us.
and that sort of thing. Yeah.
And if you're of a in a larger body, and I know this from my younger years, I was in a larger body. You're getting these micro aggressions left, right, and center, and that can be traumatic. It's
Mhm.
off, this chronic kind of trauma that you're dealing with every day. So yeah, they can be like little, call them little T traumas,
Yeah.
whatever that might be for the person, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Absolutely. Okay, well, that is great. And Stephenie, if the listeners would like to get in touch with you, how can they find you? Where can they find you?
My website is www.stepheniefarrell. That's StephenieFarrell.com.
Mhm.
I'm also on Instagram at your coach Stephenie. So they can find me there, and of course I'm on Facebook. So just look for me, Body Confidence, and Stephenie Farrell. You'll find me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. That
Thank
was
you.
wonderful. Thank you. And as always, you can find me at Meganson Method on all social media, and I look forward to seeing you next time.